Learning objective 2, we're going to take a close look here at monetary policy, which is something we've really already studied in our previous work on the monetary system. We get a pretty good grasp on the Federal Reserve Bank and how it operates in the banking system and how it achieves various policy objectives in terms of changing the interest rate. But we're going to kind of review those parts and put them together with our labor market to get a better sense of what the Federal Reserve is doing. And so from the Federal Reserve's perspective, their primary policy tool is the federal funds rate. And so you may have to go back and kind of review that section on the monetary system, but that's the interest rate that banks charge each other on overnight loans of reserves. So this is the interest rate banks charge each other on overnight loans of reserves. Right, so day-to-day transactions, you swipe your debit card, and that's saying, okay, transfer money from your bank account to someone else's bank account that's probably at another bank. And so the way that's accomplished is via the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve Bank says, okay, your bank has deposits. They basically have their own checking account at the Federal Reserve Bank, and the Fed takes money from your bank's checking account at the Fed, transfers it to the other person's bank, their deposits at the Fed. So that's moving reserves between banks on a day-to-day basis. And given that there's a required reserves that banks must meet, in order to meet that requirement, the legal requirement, and the need for these day-to-day transactions, they sometimes run short on reserves. And what do I do if I don't have reserves to cover all these transactions and meet the minimum requirement? Is I get a loan from another bank that has extra. That is the federal funds market. The interest rate on that loan is the federal funds rate. That is the rate that the Federal Reserve is going to mess around with. And it makes sense. Given that these are reserves that are held on deposit at the Fed has a lot of power to control or change the amount of reserves available and therefore affect the federal funds rate. So the way that this is accomplished, that the Federal Reserve changes the federal funds rate or hits its target, is with, again, what we call open market operations. Which is buying and selling treasury bonds or securities with banks. Okay, so remember the federal funds market. So we have the quantity of reserves on the horizontal axis and the federal funds rate on the vertical axis. That interest rate is the interest rate banks are going to pay on these loans in the federal funds market. And so there's some demand for loans that's decreasing function of the interest rate. Higher the interest rate, the less banks want to go and use this. And so they make appropriate precautions. And we have the supply, which is fixed by the Federal Reserve Bank. So if this is the Fed's target, RF1 we'll call it, it can change that target by increasing and decreasing the supply of reserves. So here I'm going to lower the target by increasing reserves. That will decrease the interest rate. Or over here I could increase the target. And we'll come up here to RF3. So depending on whether I'm trying to increase or decrease my target, I either increase or decrease the supply of reserves. If I'm going to lower the target and increase reserves, as we'll see, I'm going to buy bonds from banks. So I'm going to ask banks, okay, I'll take those treasury securities you have as an asset, And in exchange, I'm going to credit your account of reserves with $1 billion. So the bank gets an extra billion in reserves. They give the Federal Reserve some asset, the Treasury securities. That's going to increase the supply of reserves and decrease the target interest rate. If I want to increase the target rate, I have to sell bonds on the open market. So I go to banks and I say, all right, I'm going to give you some Treasury securities, and in exchange, you're going to pay us with some of your reserves. We're going to take reserves out of your account, and that will cause the interest rate in the federal funds market to increase. The federal funds rate will go up. And so that's the basics of what the Federal Reserve is going to do on a day-to-day basis to either maintain its target or to change its target. So what we want to do then, understanding that, is to look at expansionary and contractionary policy separately, how they work, how the federal funds market is operating, and how they affect labor demand.